goes live on YouTube. It should in a few seconds. Goes live. Yeah, okay, that's working. I'm going to mute that because I don't need to hear myself. Yeah, good. Okay.
We have a Q&A after, I mean, a Q&A with the audience after our Q&A.
Let's see. I hope to. I hope people will engage with their questions. So if you are now on the live stream and are thinking about putting forward questions, or even if you're feeling like you don't know how to articulate what you want to ask, just we're all here in a way that's open and public. So I think we would love your questions. Okay. So this conversation is part of the 2022 Imagine Festival of Ideas and Politics, which is based in Belfast. It's a week-long festival dedicated to new ideas on politics, culture, and activism, and all through a public program. I am Maria. I'm from Invented Futures, which is a public research platform that is building a response to dominant ways the future is made. Invented Futures asks the following questions. What kind of knowledge, systems, and capabilities are required to imagine and build alternative futures? And how might speculation from thought experiments to fiction to performance and prototypes provoke dialogue and change? We invite the public to engage with our collective, made up of researchers, writers, artists, and more. It's a platform that really wants to engage the public with these ideas outside of institutions. And so that these ideas our aim is to make sure that these ideas then empower communities or individuals to stimulate small paradigm shifts around the public's capability to re-steer the future. And so today I'm talking to Dr. Inanna Hamaty-Ataya, who is a deep thinker, a wide thinker, and a thinker who goes beyond categories. You are the founding director for the Center for Global Knowledge Studies at Cambridge, hosted by CRASH, which is the Center for Research in the Arts and Social Sciences and Humanities. You're a principal research associate and principal investigator on the ERC-funded projects Artifact and the upcoming NOAA. Inanna's research lies at the intersections of global politics, deep history, social theory, natural and historical epistemology, and the anthropology, history, and sociology of knowledge, science, and technology. So, welcome.
Thank you, Maria.
I was really interested in talking to you because I really wanted to ask you about how the different expressions of understanding of where we are now in terms of the global is tied to understanding particular trajectories or how we know what we know about ourselves. And I wanted to hear your perspective on global futures in the plural, and what transformations may need to occur in the ongoing story and why transformation. And when it comes to the present relationship with deep history, why is transformation itself very complicated and complex? So I wanted to start really at the basic level, which is, why have you decided to ask big questions? Your research tracks the development of human knowledge on the grander scale from the very beginnings of our species to the world at the present moment and beyond. Why these large questions?
Well, I think that we're living in a very unique moment in our history that somehow forces us to ask big questions about our present and our future, but also about our past. And, this is not unusual in our intellectual and cultural history. If you look at ancestral stories, mythologies, world religions, philosophies of history, social theories, or even political ideologies, you'll find that we've always actually been addressing big questions, either explicitly or implicitly. And essentially, this is because we as humans need to understand ourselves beyond the minute details of our daily lives, our individual experiences, and we need to get a sense of the meaning of our existence and where we're heading. So, this really is, I think, a constant feature of how we engage the world. And we're, of course, also very concerned about the values that organize our lives, about how we can achieve what we think of as progress, or what philosophers call the good life, in a way that doesn't involve undermining or fighting one another, or destroying our environment. So in a way, I think the big questions, have always been with us, and they're really an intrinsic feature of how we evolve and how we think of ourselves, and our capacity to imagine alternative or better futures, as the mission of your own group explicitly states. And the problem, of course, is that the world is complex, and to understand the big questions and to provide big answers, you really have to zoom in on very specific issues. So in the past 2 centuries or so, the way that we study the world, whether it's society or nature, has become increasingly fragmented. You have an increasing number of disciplines and sub-disciplines constantly emerging, and they focus more and more on very specific aspects. Academic expertise has become very highly specialized, and at the same time, of course, much narrower, in the same way that in the field of medicine, you'll find specialists that focus on very specific organs or systems, and generalists have a wider view, but don't have, as much advanced insights into the way that the body operates in particular ways. So the whole of academia actually has become a bit like this. And this creates particular obstacles, I would say. It takes a much longer period of time for any one academic to become really trained in their field. You become socialized, you become sort of within your own little bubble. And the whole research and education system really encourages you to pursue very specific advanced questions. And if you look at the development of academic disciplines, you'll find that very often the greatest innovations are also very much occurring at these cutting edge within these very small niches. So we've really moved away from that older model of scholarship, where you could be a natural scientist and a philosopher and a poet at the same time, and be able to think very widely about the world and human experience. And now any specialist who's interested in how their work relates to big questions and to the bigger picture is going to face very serious challenges, in trying to access and digest all these insights produced across these very various specialties. So we've developed this concept of interdisciplinary work to try and reintegrate what was once integrated into natural philosophy or moral philosophy. And this, of course, is very essential. It helps us to think collectively again, to combine very different methodologies, so we can address the larger questions that you were mentioning at the beginning. So to link back to your question about my own work, as a social scientist working at the intersections of all the disciplines that you mentioned, I realized that there were many problems I was interested in investigating that required this greater scope and a greater depth of analysis, because they were ultimately relevant to wider issues of human development. For example, many social sciences operate with very specific understandings of science and technology that sometimes or often erase entire systems of knowledge. So we call them indigenous knowledges, traditional knowledges, etc. And we tend to view technology also as a very modern phenomenon, associated with modernist perspectives on the world as opposed to traditional ones. But in fact, these partitions are really not helpful, and they prevent us from recognizing the work of our technical reason across the ages, across very different spheres of life, even if the objects or behaviors that we associate with these different kinds of knowledges, are classified differently in society. So, for example, if you think of something very simple, the kind of knowledges that are invested in cooking or food processing are pretty much the same kinds of knowledges that are invested in scientific chemical experiments happening in the lab. And the fact that that system of knowledge belongs to culture in one case, or is assigned to culture in one case, and is assigned to science in another case, doesn't really change the fact that it is pretty much the same kind of knowledge that is formulated in very different configurations of human understanding. Another issue also that prompted me to develop a larger framework has to do with the way that we conceptualize the social in the social sciences. And we pretty much tend to think of it certainly since the 18th or 19th century as mostly related to societies as we understand them, modern societies, to states, to nations, as you can visualize them on a political map. So when we say, that a phenomenon is social, we tend to think very often within this very presentist, what some sociologists call methodologically nationalist framework. But most of the questions that I was interested in actually didn't fit neatly into this. They didn't fit with that configuration of land and territory and institutions. And you just need to go back a few centuries or millennia to realize that you cannot really make sense of our cultural and environmental history as a species if you don't expand that current understanding of what society means. And so I prefer to think of it in terms of association rather than society, which I think is the more accurate term. And of course, the concept of association enables us to think beyond human-to-human relations and start thinking in terms of the human-non-human relations that are also absolutely essential to what we call human sociality. So once you start expanding the framework in time and space and these kinds of concepts, the big picture actually starts to take shape almost naturally, and you become very quickly drawn toward the big questions as well.
Yeah, interesting. I really was interested in talking to you as someone who deals with these scales, who is combining and recombining global and local perspectives in order to develop an understanding of what we are now in terms of the global. And you're doing it through looking closely at what knowledge is, what it does, what we do with it. Are you dedicated to forming a common story of this, of what we share? And why do you think it's important to do this?
Yes, that's very perceptive, actually, Maria. I am indeed interested in telling a common story about us, about humanity. And the story can only be one that connects us not only to one another, but also to, as I said, to other species and to what we call nature. We call it nature, and we've become accustomed to separating ourselves from it as if it were something distinguished. But our relation to it is, of course, very essential. And again, there is a long tradition of stories that address these big questions or try to formulate some wisdoms about our existence and the meaning of all of this. So if you think of the earliest known origin stories, for example, they were stories of this kind. They were developed collectively, they were passed down orally across generations, they were eventually written down. And then in time, they became superseded by scientific theories of human evolution. And today there's a resurgence of this kind of storytelling at a big scale in the form of what is called big history, which is basically a story of everything from the beginning of the formation of the universe to the present time. And of course, this is all very appealing and incredibly fascinating. It really puts our own very, very short history on this planet into perspective. And it helps us to understand also how we fit into the general story of matter and life and all this. But in my own work, I'm really interested in reconnecting with that earlier, more traditional form of wisdom that was captured, I think, quite powerfully by early mythologies and origin stories. And I think that this is why they have had such a very strong impact on our collective mind for thousands of years. And the idea is that I think our historical and our scientific knowledges have sufficiently advanced today for us to be able to write those kinds of stories, but in a more accurate version. A version that is really capable of conveying the same kind of existential and moral significance, but within a more accurate and perfectible understanding of how the world works, of how human beings and societies operate, etc. So I can give a simple example that might resonate with people because it's well known. Think of the story of the flood. So there are very different versions of that story across cultures. And this is a very powerful example, I think, of how you can record, store the knowledges of your time, your understanding of nature, and simultaneously present really a commitment to life and a system of value. I think this is what the story also presents, and a call for compassion. And you can see exactly the same kind of ethical perspective that's arising today in the debate on the Anthropocene and anthropogenic climate change, when we think of the Earth as our home, and we think of ourselves as stewards of the Earth, which is really just a different way of saying we're all Noah, basically. And we're all really responsible for the harm that we've caused, and we all have a duty of care. So the parallels are there, and we're just operating within very different historical periods, very different forms of consciousness, but the big questions are all the same, and the motivation, I think, is also the same. Sorry. And so I think that, it's really important also to be able to tell these common stories today. Not only because we're living in a world that is globalized and we're facing, climate change and potentially a mass extinction, and we really need to develop new ways of thinking about ourselves within the world of nature. It's also important because the world is economically and politically fragmented and divided, and we're reminded of this every day. There are so many perspectives and ideologies that see human communities as profoundly different, that focus on the diversity of our cultures, and the different ways of being in the world, and they conceive of this diversity as differences that really separate us from one another. And many of our identities, of course, are constructed in this way, and we're particularly attached to them. So I think that in this context of ideological division and all this tension, I think it's very important to be able to tell the story of our commonality, of our belonging to a single family, in a way that doesn't erase the cultural richness of humanity, but on the contrary shows that actually diversity is just a manifestation and a product of what we have in common. So we cook differently, we eat different kinds of foods, and we consume them in very different ways, but we all cook. And this is a very distinctive cultural behavior of humanity. And we all develop material and symbolic attachments, to our food in very similar ways. we all share an evolutionary capacity to think about the invisible, to imagine alternative worlds, alternative futures. And the fact that we have produced, different mythologies, that we carry out different kinds of religious rituals or believe in different deities, or that we have abstractions about gravity rather than gods, all this, again, is just the expression of a very single, unified, common behavior. And we can say the same things about our aesthetic dispositions, for example. It used to be ordinary just a few decades ago to speak of, proper arts as opposed to primitive arts, which often was not considered arts at all. But really, once you look at the long history of human artistic practice, these divisions are very silly and they appear very ideological. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the fact that human communities, have deployed the same behaviors wherever they were located, and they have consistently adapted these behaviors to particular contexts of life, is the more important criterion. And once you start thinking in these terms, you realize that differences are actually an evidence of sameness. And together, these differences tell us something about how wide, how innovative our engagement with the world is, and how unique we are as a cultural species. Not superior, but unique. And yes, this is what drives my current research on the deep history of human knowledge and culture. And this is the kind of vision and wisdom, I suppose, that I hope to be able to extract from it.
Yes. And from what I'm hearing, it's the process of recovering these manifestations and, in a way, expressing the constitution of those manifestations as common, as global, as a history. I think in my work with the Invented Futures Collective, we're preoccupied by the notions of imaginaries and expressions of speculative cultural artifacts about some kind of future, because this is all expressions of values or ethics or things that either you want to bring forward or see or anticipate or hope for. I think in order, to move the conversation on, I think perhaps I would like to ask you, I would like to continue with this, the recovery of wisdom, perhaps. But I would quite like to ask you if there were any small, local, close hooks, objects, relations that you have picked up on in your work that have helped you in the process of tracing these manifestations in order to constitute a common story.
Oh, that's a nice question. I suppose that you can start from any object. If you trace the global history of any particular object, scientific, cultural, an artifact or a technique, etc., you will find that the connections become global. I mean, of course, there are things, there are innovations that remain local or that are never that never go beyond, the realm of the particular communities that produce them. But that's very rare, because historically there have been very few communities that were absolutely isolated. And so the history of human cultural endeavors is really a connected history. And a lot of it, of course, is also very violent. It's a history of oppression. It's a history of conflict, of war, of subjugation of some societies, etc. And a lot of our cultural artifacts and our sciences and our knowledges have, in fact, circulated through these structures. So very often these local histories connect you to very hopeful and very happy kinds of stories, and often they connect you to the darker aspects or episodes in our common history. But there is almost no example that wouldn't, help you retrace that. So I mentioned food a few minutes ago, and this is certainly one of the easiest way to really to capture that sense of globality and commonality in time and space across cultures. And it's a very good way also of reflectively addressing these issues that we think are so crucial to our differences, because everyone is very attached, to their local cuisines. We tend to think of specific foods as, as associated with particular cultures or nations, or sometimes even with particular religions, either positively or negatively through, forbidden foods or taboos, etc. And very often people have a distorted understanding of the origin of their foods or how global they actually are. A very simple example is, the tomato and its association with Italian food, or even pasta for that matter, and its association with Italian food. But of course, the tomato is not didn't originate on the European continent, and it took actually centuries for it to establish itself as an acceptable food within Christian Europe. So these are very good examples because it also connects to crops, so it connects to our ecology. It connects to very, very ancestral knowledges that we developed after the transition to agriculture for several millennia in very different ecological conditions. And it's quite remarkable when you think of it, when you retrace that transition, and this is another aspect of our commonality, that, if you look at the history of the emergence, the domestication of particular crops, you'll find that the same mode of domestication appeared across the globe in very different communities that were not connected at all. And so there was a common way of life, a common innovation toward a very similar solution, except that the crops were different because the biomes, the habitats were different. And the structures that were developed around them also were different. So you find that social organization in Central America, for example, was very different from the social organization in Mesopotamia or in what is today China. But in the end, at some point, these crops also started to travel, and they traveled with people, and the techniques for domesticating them traveled with them. And they became incorporated into local cuisines, and then they became exported again. So there are many, of course, wheat is one such crop. It's a very simple, it has almost no resemblance to the original wheat. As a colleague here in Cambridge put it, it's a wheat on steroids. The wheat that we use today, the engineered wheat following the green agricultural revolution. But it is wheat. It is one version of its former self, of the wild relative that we first domesticated. And today you wouldn't be able to say, that wheat or barley only belongs to a particular place or to a particular culture. It has gone global. Actually, it's one of the 5 or so central crops that sustain our food regime. The same thing for rice. The same thing goes for maize or corn. So these are natural objects or eco-facts that have become somehow artifacts because we have transformed them into cultural objects of human technique, of human techne. And they're simple and they're alive. They are organisms. They have a natural evolution of their own that we have hijacked, and they've become part of our culture. So they're fascinating, very simple objects that you can zoom in on, and then through them you travel in time and in space. And you get a sense of how the local and the global are connected. You get a sense of how humanity is connected. And it's a story of reinvention constantly, the way that we appropriate them, what they mean to us, how they become symbols, how they become common symbols, and sometimes symbols that separate us. So, we distinguish ourselves through the food that we eat and don't eat. Social classes are distinguished also by, the way that the ingredients are selected and they're prepared and presented, and whether you have big portions or small portions. And wine is another example. Of course, it's one of the oldest fermented products that humanity has used, but it has developed into also a segregated symbol of class and prestige, etc. So you can tell many different stories by looking at the world of food. But there are also very simple things like, the wheel. This is also one of the earliest inventions of our more recent history, not what historians call prehistory, but of our history. You can look also at the development of languages. That's also a very interesting thing. You can trace more or less up to 10,000 years of linguistic evolution and see how languages have interacted and have borrowed from each other and transformed, and how some of them descend from earlier languages of people that were migrating across, very different places. So this is also a very fascinating way of linking the local and the global and these connected histories. And I think that everything that has to do with, the tools that we use, if you go back in history, there are some tools that are found absolutely everywhere. There are some practices that are found everywhere. So burying our dead, for example, this is something that we've been doing as a species for at least 120,000 years. For at least 20,000 years, we've been putting flowers in burials, in cemeteries, and with rituals to commemorate the dead. So you can zoom in on a particular archaeological site and just completely, fall in love with the specificities, with the details. But everything that you look at, you can, in order to tell that story, that particular story, and to make sense of it, you end up, looking at the wider story. Same thing. Last year, I spent about 2 weeks just completely in love with a puppy that was found a couple of years ago. That's 17,000 years old, that was found in permafrost in the Arctic, in Siberia. And what does this puppy mean? And is it a wolf or a dog? Is he part of those animals that we domesticated, that were part of our lives, that we ended up burying alongside us and caring for them, and etc. So from one particular instance, you can reconstruct all these much more common and widely shared and widely diffused practices that also say a lot about our social organization, our systems of values, and how these have developed. So I think that that particular kind of global history that looks at global objects is just as informative of what we are as a history of societies, or a political history of I don't know, war and or religion and all these things.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I'd like to get you to talk more about how these practices, these local small practices, when we go on to think about the future, about creating solutions to crises such as climate crises, but also within agricultural production as well, in food production and sustainability. How methodologies that come to make sense of these crises, that come to make sense of the story as it is presently and will become, from climate to movement and migration, where does it leave these practices, these people, these communities, this wisdom? And I guess before we get on to that, perhaps I know that through your work, you have focused on agricultural production, and you've, I think, said a lot already about why. But in terms of thinking about emerging problems and present problems and the endeavor to create solutions to crises, and how the cyclical tools or the tools that keep coming back, how these crises might be a disruptor of this kind of innovation. So my question is simply first, why, if you agree, you have chosen to focus on agricultural production?
Right. Well, agriculture is really a fascinating, I don't know what to call it. It's not just a mode of production. It's really I call it a paradigm of life, because it really changes completely. As a mode of subsistence, it determines the way that we interact with nature, the way that we sustain ourselves, the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we divide labor. And it has completely really shaped our social evolution, our cultural evolution, our political evolution. It has given a different meaning to, the land and territory. The development of agriculture, and also the adoption of new agricultural innovations by some countries and not others, or by some communities and not others, has also established asymmetries and inequalities that enabled particular form of political domination in history. So once you start looking at it from these very different perspectives and angles, it gives you really, it's more than a case study. It's sort of the essence, or it gives you in its own history a condensed history of so many aspects of our evolution. So this is why I was particularly fascinated by it. I mean, you can get into the purely technical, botanical or plant science aspect of agriculture, all the way to what we were talking about, which is culture itself. And the two are connected, of course. Our conception of culture is related to cultivation, and that's not a coincidence. But also religious mythologies and all this. So this is obviously an activity or a practice that has very wide consequences. And once you start delving into it, it becomes really a unifying framework within which to think about how we are in the world as a species, because we are in the world in very different ways than others who, have a very restricted form of diet, whereas we are omnivorous, don't change their ecological niches in the way that we do, whereas we can transform an environment's carrying capacity in extraordinary ways. And of course, agriculture links to that future you were talking about, because we have developed such an exploitative model out of it that it has fundamentally affected the earth itself. And it is completely related, to all the factors that have led to anthropogenic climate change. And it is also now being invested in lots of aspirations for, finding solutions, because we cannot, at this point in time, given our scientific knowledges, we cannot develop a complete alternative to it. So if we want to keep producing as heterotrophs without the ability of photosynthesis, if we want to be able to produce our food, then we have to preserve the ecosystems that are necessary for them. And so that's interesting. It links to issues of the future that you were talking about, because then we really have to rethink the way that we exploit. Basically, we are exploiting. Domestication is a very peculiar way of managing your sources of food. There are non-human species that also have a form of domestication, but what we do is quite unique. And in many ways, it's a form of co-domestication because we have selected particular crops and we have enhanced them and given them protection from parasites and from competitors, etc. But they have also somehow domesticated us because particular crops they shape a food system and an organization of the land in particular ways, and we have adapted to them also. So it's a very tight story of co-evolution, and today we have to rethink all of this. And there are various ways, I think, in which this is being done. One of them is to simply extend our understanding of agricultural practices from before the Industrial Revolution and before the Green Revolution. And a lot of work is being done today to revalorize what used to be called simply indigenous knowledges, non-scientific agricultural practices, because these were practices that were especially important for the preservation of biodiversity. They were sustainable practices. And there are also many non-agriculturalists who say that actually hunter-gatherers are also very well placed to provide models and solutions because the hunter-gatherer fisher mode of life, a mode of subsistence, was also very much more sustainable and preserves the kinds of knowledges that you need in order to have a more symbiotic relation, a more harmonious relation to nature. So there is this particular orientation that is towards the preservation of biodiversity and identifying sustainable ways of developing our agrarian paradigm. And there are other new technologies that are emerging today that are sort of going a bit beyond that particular framework. So for example, vertical farming is one of them, underground farming also. And these are very interesting technologies because they relate to our, they change our concepts of the agricultural landscape. It's a different way of managing resources. It's also a sort of more high-tech kind of agricultural practice, and the spaces of food production change completely. And then you have, of course, plant-based alternatives to meat and what is called cellular agriculture, which shouldn't be called agriculture at all because you're not doing the actual, it's no longer within the paradigm of working a land, investing labor in the land and with crops, etc. You're working in the lab directly on molecules and cells and tissues, etc. And these are very interesting, at this point, very, very costly technological solutions, but their cost is going down very quickly. And I think that there is, it's already on the market, and there are already very clear examples of uptake for these kinds of new products, and the technology is spreading. So I think that these, in terms of imagining our futures, this is certainly one technological innovation that is going to be distinctive, and that possibly might change our relation. If we're able not to eat animals, and if we don't need to keep so many bovines, and if the stock of domesticated animals becomes much more reduced, there are also all sorts of ethical and moral decisions that come with that. There is a whole tendency to think of cellular agriculture as enabling a clean diet, a diet that doesn't include, killing other species. It's now even developing to the pet food market, so that you might be able to keep a pet and feed your pet fake meat without having to deal with that terrible moral dilemma of you being a vegetarian, but that is still, exploiting other species for your own favorite animal. So it goes, again, it's one of these things. Once you've looked at the history of cultural innovations at a large scale, you can start to anticipate the kinds of trends that new technologies might bring with them. And certainly, I think that agriculture is one essential sector or area of human life that is very much the focus of all these very different kinds of solutions. And they're happening quite quickly, but certainly there's a very wide range of solutions, and some of them are more traditional. We're sort of going back in time to recognize that actually scientific progress doesn't mean that earlier forms of knowledge should be disregarded. And I think that that's a very positive attitude, because I think knowledge is cumulative. So you don't, some things are no longer valid, but other things remain so. And we're discovering actually that earlier forms of technical engagement with nature were much more sustainable and, as I said, more symbiotic with the natural pace at which nature evolves. But at the same time, we're looking at new technologies, and it will be interesting to see how much of the future is still shaped by this idea of, developing techno fixes for the problems that technology itself has created, or whether we, favor alternatives that are potentially less advanced, but do the job just as well.
Yes, I think you've comprehensively answered some follow-up questions I
Good,
had,
I'm glad.
which was around, the present, the contemporary crises in sustainability, and all of this makes clear that perhaps you can no longer solve these problems solely with the same categories that created them. And yet, how do you still create this new ethical framework in this kind of entangled way? So what knowledge needs to be recovered to face a future that isn't reproducing, but is transforming? But how do you replace transformations that in themselves, those initial transformations were violent, oppressive, complex? I think I'll leave. I have a final question for you, but I would also like to perhaps insert a question, which is, well, in your work, you think about potential paths and trajectories that could have been by way of showing what we are. Is there value in keeping these what could have beens as knowledge about us too? Is there a way of collecting trajectories that did not occur? Is this a valuable task for you and your work?
That's a very interesting question. I think that there's always a value to imagining alternatives, if only, as an intellectual exercise that helps you think in terms of multiple pathways. And then also to think about what makes some trajectories more likely to become real and efficient, and others to never be realized and to never materialize. Because then you think about structures and systemic parameters, and whether and what kinds of variables need to sort of combine. So it's for an academic, I think it's a very useful exercise. Now, whether it gives us also opportunities to say something more meaningful and more practical and useful for our future, I think that many academics, many historians specifically, will say that yes, it does. Especially if we think that some trajectories were not realized because they were cut short not by a sort of natural evolution of a particular community, but because of asymmetrical relations, forms of political violence, imperialism, and all this. So to think about how, for example, particular communities of hunters and gatherers were completely dominated by the first generations of agriculturalists who were better fed, managed to to have stocks of food, and so could have a wider division of labor, and so could develop weapons and an army, and have a more complex society. And so how a particular mode of life simply disappeared, and almost completely disappeared. I mean, it still exists at a very small scale. But yes, it is a very interesting thing to ask what might have happened if, as a species collectively, we did not, if the Holocene never happened, if we continued to be hunters and gatherers everywhere. I mean, there was a very long transition to agriculture. We did know how to maintain and attend to particular crops. So agriculturalists were not, the first to understand how domestication worked. But imagine if on a big scale, or in particular regions that are today especially affected by climate change, that alternative or parallel trajectories continue to coexist, and the potential that we would the wider views and the greater understanding we would have today if these had existed. So to imagine what might have, how different trends might have evolved is, I think, also very, very valuable and very meaningful. And apart from agriculture, I think that just in general, it's just to know that we always had options also. I don't think we've ever been in a position where there is such a unified, what we call a global consciousness. I don't think that has ever existed in that form, where we can, gather the scientific community and other public sectors and other personalities and authorities and say something needs to be done and we need to invest resources into it. This is really unique. But for these people to have a perspective, I think it's very important to have a sense of all the options that were before us and all the possible kinds of transformations and evolutions that might have happened. And actually, global history has also been very partial. Entire regions of the world were completely ignored from global history until very recently. And so I think that we still need to, before we start thinking about what could have been, we still have a lot to do in terms of recapturing what actually has been. And we will find, I'm sure, that there is also a greater diversity and very different ways that humanity has deployed to react to its environment. I mean, environmental crises have existed for a very long time. We just, because we don't look very often beyond history, unless you're a paleoanthropologist, completely immersed in that period, which is the period of the Pleistocene. All the historians and the social scientists work within that period where the planet is warm and there's a stable climate, and then suddenly everything, becomes disrupted. But in fact, before the Holocene, there were disruptions. and yet we thrived as a species. We developed, we had art and we had religion, and we had laughter and musical instruments, and we created myths, and we had clothes and pets, as I mentioned, etc. So there's a lot to learn if we realize that that period is also a very interesting and very innovative period in our history. I think innovative is what I would stress, because so-called prehistoric humanity is often perceived outside of the field of experts studying it as, you know, a backward, barbaric, very basic sort of caveman. This is the caveman image of humanity, in the same way that we think of Neanderthals as barbaric, and we use them precisely as a metaphor for barbarism, which is completely crazy, because that's absolutely, you know, they were innovative, and they were very, very close to us, actually. And prehistoric humanity as Homo sapiens was also incredibly innovative. I would say that it was comparatively more innovative than we have been in the past millennia, because the challenges that it faced were much more, were much greater, and at the same time it was sort of starting from scratch, whereas we have the advantage of, you know, the ratchet effects of cumulated and exponential technology. So yeah, that's what I would say, that there is already a lot in our actual history to think in terms of parallel and alternate, not alternative, but, you know, sometimes these patterns alternate cyclically. There is a lot to discover that I think we can learn from.
Excellent. Thank you. I could have one more question, but I am going to see if there are other questions from people watching live, if anyone has them. Let me just check. Now is your chance. Okay. Yeah, so what did I want to ask that is not repeating? Or maybe this is too big, but and perhaps you have answered it very finely, specifically around this notion of transformation, how you would separate it from reproducing or reproduction. You as transforming, you know, crises or what we have now. Is this a question of recovering what we already have? Is it about reproducing, or is it recovering?
I suppose that there's a conceptual element in your question, that it depends at what level you're looking at the transformation. Sometimes we transform our tools, but the system, you know, the rationale for using them is still the same. So in that sense, I think that recovering traditional knowledges and practices within agriculture, for example, and rereading them, reinterpreting them in the context of today is more of is less of a transformation, and well, it is certainly at some point, at some level, intellectual level, a transformation in the way that we understand what an advanced technology is. And I do think that this is important, because I think people have very often a distorted understanding of what progress means in technological terms. So what is a more technologically advanced instrument? It could be, that it's an instrument that is faster, more efficient at the task that that it's supposed to fulfill, etc. But I think that this is very abstract, and that we need to inscribe that notion of relevance and progress within the whole system of use, right? So even agriculture itself, you cannot say that it is in itself a transformation that was superior to what came before it, and that an agricultural society is by definition a more advanced society than a hunter-gatherer society. And there are examples in history of communities who were agriculturalists, and once they moved into a different habitat, reverted to a hunter-gatherer mode of life. And to describe this transformation as being a sort of backward transformation, as them having lost or gone back to an earlier form, is I think a very misguided way of looking at it. Because what they did actually was successfully adapt their mode of subsistence to their new environment. So this is a real transformation, and this is a transformation in the sense of an adaptive one. And for me, this is how progress or success in epistemic terms can be measured. And so, depending on what the transformation is and how you're looking at it, I think it's possible to conceive of some techniques as being transformative in themselves, or simply as serving, as being repackaged or reconceived or used differently to serve a new model. But it's possible for new technologies to serve old models. So the transformation the innovation is at a different level. And it would be interesting to see how in the future, what transforms and what doesn't, or how these different connected transformations. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the way that, our systems of values will change. And whether we're moving really towards a common humanist framework to think about life and rights and all of this, or whether actually a multiplicity of systems might continue to diverge. And so systems of values are interesting. Ways of relating to space also. So architecture, this is why, the Anthropocene conversation, once it got beyond the circle of earth scientists and geologists, it became really interesting, because everyone is talking within the same awareness of the same phenomenon and trying to see how it alters, what are its implications for the particular field that they're studying, but also for the discipline itself. What does it mean to be an anthropologist, or what does it mean to be a historian if the future is now, if we're crashing into the future? What does it mean to be a political scientist, etc., or to study I don't know, religions or the human-animal connection, etc. So this is all very interesting. So as I said, the human-animal connection, my canine companion came in.
It's a mention of values. I'm just going to check if there are.
It's fine.
There are no questions. But thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
This has been the scale of this has been very satisfying for me.
I'm glad.
Also all of the examples and smaller details. I think it was kind of your Yeah, thinking and work in action, which in 1 hour, which
Yeah, well,
and I really appreciate it.
thank you very much.
Is there anything
I
you want
think
to?
no, your questions actually were very very good at sort of launching me in a particular direction, and I think it's wonderful because very often, you know, the academic framing of things that doesn't start from these, very often doesn't start from these common points of departure, and it's going to be how does it relate to this theory, or it will be framed within a very particular perspective because the stakes are different. You know, the academic stakes are a bit different, and the conversation has to be meaningful in relation to the field itself. But your questions, I think, it would be difficult to answer them within a particular field, and so that's very comfortable for me because, indeed, you know, I'm trying to think across these fields, and I'm trying to think. The challenge is to think about the right questions precisely. It's not about the answers in the first instance. It's really to say what is the right way of looking at this? What is the right thing to wonder about? And yeah, so thank you very much for providing a perfect framing for all of these somewhat chaotic observations.
Chaotic, not chaotic at all to me. Thank you. And is there anything you want to mention about what's coming up for you?
Well, there is the NOAA project that you mentioned that is that focuses on helping family farmers to securely transfer agricultural practices between different regions that are becoming affected by climate change in very different ways. So this goes back to this, to what we discussed about ancestral agricultural knowledges that are not developed in university laboratories or in the R&D departments of the big food industry, but that have been intergenerationally transmitted for hundreds and thousands of years. And today, these producers are facing a terrible situation because basically the temperatures are changing, the whole ecosystem is changing, and their practices and their knowledges are adjusted to a normal Holocene, you know, climatic cycle of variation, which is very gradual, which enables, which gives time to knowledge systems to adapt and to transform. So this is a very practical instance in which to think about transformations, and not just thinking about how agriculture can help solve issues of climate change, but also how we can help agriculturalists face climate change, especially because some particular kinds of productions are very sensitive and are not protected. There is no protection if you lose your cultural assets. If you can no longer produce at a certain, you know, within certain parameters, then that's it. You lose, for example, the designation, the protected designation that you have, because all these designations are related to very, very specific production parameters. So with this project, I'm sort of moving beyond basic science to the world of what funding agencies call social impact, but it's basically, you know, bringing what I understand about all these long-term patterns to an intervention that is more valuable to the real people that I study. And so, yeah, we'll see how this develops, but it's a very exciting thing to have received funding for it and to start thinking within the framework of a social enterprise. So hopefully I'll be able to update you within a year and a half. But yeah, this is the closest in forthcoming news that I have.
Excellent. Yes, and thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to Anana. Keep track of that upcoming project. Keep track of the Invented Futures Collective, and keep track of all of the events during the Imagine Festival of Ideas and Politics. Thank you.